The God of the Kabbalists exists at considerable remove from the biblical God of Israel. The Greco-Arabic conquest of Jewish thought in the Middle Ages brought with it various theologies, none of which accepted the descriptions of God found in Scripture or ancient rabbinic sources at face value. Prime mover and cause of causes, the philosophical God was beyond description. Kabbalah, which emerged over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, largely incorporated this philosophically informed theology. God, said the Kabbalists, has two aspects. The first was the God of the philosophers, the utterly unknowable prime mover, which they called Ein Sof, no end or infinite. The second, 10 hypostatic Sphirot, from Keter, crown, to Malchut, kingdom. The latter constitute God's fecund interface with creation and could thus be known. Their structure was also susceptible to visualization, whether in the mind's eye or drawn on paper or parchment. Although Kabbalists used a variety of schemata to visualize this invisible realm, over the 14th and 15th centuries, the Arboreal Schema attained particular prominence. Thus was born the Kabbalistic tree. On Kabbalistic trees, the words Ein Sof often hover atop the spherotic array, as we see here. I read the half-blackened medallion in which they are inscribed as a symbolic signifier, meaning that it is not meant to resemble its referent, but to symbolize its impenetrability to human thought. The second aspect, the 10 Spherot, are of course represented by the tree. The name of each is typically written in bold script within the circles, followed by additional appellations. Longer texts are inscribed in interstitial spaces near the features on the parchment to which they refer. What made the tree so compelling as a visualization of the spherotic array? How might its ascendance be explained? The Arboreal Schema was a versatile diagrammatic device with diverse, albeit specialized, applications. Akin to today's Venn diagram, it was an information graphic ideally suited for the visual representation of abstract relations. The Arboreal Schema had achieved preeminent status in the scientific treatises of the Middle Ages, particularly in works of natural philosophy. It was famously deployed in Porphyry's commentary on Aristotle's categories to visualize the scale of being as a series of dichotomies that branch off of a central column with perfect symmetry. The most abstract and general concept, substance, is at the top or crown of the tree. Then follow body, animate body, animal, and man. The very same device conveniently mapped lineages as well, as we may see in this tree of Jesse in a mid-14th century French manuscript. As you gaze upon this diagram of Jesus' ancestry, which perhaps for a moment you mistook for a Kabbalistic tree, let it land. Diagrams must never be interpreted on the basis of morphology alone. Why did this schema prove so congenial to the medieval Kabbalists? First, because the appropriation was consistent with their self-perception. Kabbalists understood themselves as men of science, engaged in the pursuit of Chokhmat HaNistar, the occult science. It was thus no accident that, as they diagrammed the Sphirot, they availed themselves of trees and concentric circles, the schemata associated with natural philosophy and astronomy, respectively. These were the most prestigious scientific fields of the Middle Ages. Like astronomers, Kabbalists treated and attempted to visualize the invisible. Trees, however, had an undeniable advantage over circles when it came to representing the divine. And this is the second reason I believe the schema was ultimately embraced so extensively. Unlike the circles that signify the crystalline orbs they resembled, the tree was not an iconic signifier. When used to visualize concepts from the scale of being to virtues and vices, it contrasted central and peripheral, primary and derivative, representing relations without actually resembling them. This ability to visualize without any implication of morphological resemblance was an undeniable advantage in a cultural setting within which the iconic representation of the divine was taboo. The spherotic array could thus be drawn without any necessary implication of space, and plausibly defended as showing causal relations. In short, the Godhead could be imaged with a schema boasting a prestigious scientific pedigree that bore no corporeal baggage. The aniconic perception of the Kabbalistic tree is also suggested by the austerity of its visual language. Even after the near-canonical conflation of spherotic structure with the arboreal schema, the latter were drawn without a trace of decorative, phytomorphic embellishment. This stands in stark contrast to the arboreal diagrams in the medieval and early modern Christian visual tradition from at least the 10th century onward. There are rare exceptions in Kabbalistic manuscripts, but even in these, the representational embellishments are exceedingly subtle. So we may observe in this leafy spherotic tree in an Italian manuscript dating to 1578. Kabbalistic trees, then, picture the divine as a tree of sphirot. The term sphirot did not, however, originally refer to the 10 constitutive hypostases of Kabbalistic esotericism. The neologism appeared for the first time in the late antique cosmological work Sefer Yetsirah, Book of Creation, where its primary signification was things subject to counting. The 10 Spherot of Sefer Yetsirah are thus far removed from the hypostases of theosophical Kabbalah, with which they can be reconciled only with stubborn determination. According to one Mishnah of Sefer Yetsirah, the 10 Spherot, meaning the counted things fundamental to creation, are the 2 vectors of time, the 2 vectors of value, good and bad, and the 6 directions of 3-dimensional space. According to another, in addition to the 6 directions of 3-dimensional space, the Spirit of the living God, air from spirit, water from air, and fire from water are to be counted. Its quasi-biblical status in the Kabbalah notwithstanding, Sefer Yetzirah must not be mistaken for a Kabbalistic book. Thanks to its multivocal Hebrew root, Samech Pei Reish, the term Sphira carried a broad range of connotations and associations, from story and things written to sapphire. It also resonated with sphere, even if not derived etymologically from the Greek sphera. In the hypostatic sense characteristic of their medieval transvaluation, some Kabbalists understood them to be part and parcel of the divine essence, atzmut, and others as instruments of divine action, kelim. The latter was more theologically and philosophically defensible, but was, over the longue durée of Kabbalistic speculation, the less popular option. One thing was, however, a matter of universal consensus. Thanks to the apodictic pronouncement of Sefer Yetzirah, it was axiomatic that there were 10 Sphirot, and that the knowledge of their characteristics and pathways was the key to unlock the most profound secrets of nature and scripture. If the Porphyrian tree visualized the incremental drill down of ontological categories from the general to the specific, and the tree of Jesse, or any genealogical tree, shows how an ancestral root could come to bear fruit, the Spherotic tree is the double helix of Kabbalah, underlying and generating the full panoply of reality. Not satisfied with a meager chain of being along Porphyrian lines, the Kabbalists infused the tree with unprecedented implications of fractal fecundity. If its graphical image remained faithful to its natural philosophical origins, its mental image was more rhizomatic than arboreal. In performative contemplation, the Kabbalist imbued it with aspects after and within aspects. It was endlessness encoded. One more word is in order with regard to the image. Its indexical rather than iconic representation may have facilitated its reception, but an image it remained, and an image of God at that. In a culture in which all pictures were presumed to make their reference imminent, the Kabbalistic tree was inevitably perceived as the esoteric image of the tabernacle, a structure designed to facilitate divine presence. The Arboreal Schema may have gradually assumed pride of place, but a broad range of schemata were deployed by Kabbalists to visualize their cosmological lore. Most were so-called epistemic images, intended to clarify the texts beside which they appeared. A number of freestanding diagrams are nevertheless preserved in the two oldest miscellany, codices, that contain Kabbalistic materials to have reached us. Copied in 1284 and 1286 from Spanish manuscripts that had reached Italy not long before. Rather than clarifying passages in the esoteric works collected in these miscellanies, the diagrams have been copied into the interstitial spaces between them. A diverse range of schemata is on display in these manuscripts. We see, for example, the 10 Spherot configured as a wagon wheel in the 1284 Codex held by the Bibliothèque Nationale, the manuscript we have gathered to celebrate today. Though very nearly in the places we've come to expect them, this visualization of the network places 8 Sphirot symmetrically arrayed on the outer rim, with the 2 remaining in the center and on the vertical spoke below it. The Sphira of Tiferet, beauty, is at the axis point, indicating its special status in the theosophical doctrine of the Kabbalists who fashioned it. Malchut, the lowest Sphira, seems intentionally bottom-weighted at 6 o'clock, its medallion the only one contiguous with the framing circle that circumscribes the entire figure. All the medallions are inscribed with the common theosophical names of the Sphirot, to which the names of their respective associated biblical patriarchs have been added. The circular morphology of the schema was likely meant to evoke the axiomatic phrase in Sefer Yetsirah, "Their end is fixed in their beginning." The 1286 Codex, now in Parma, includes 2 rotae, or circle diagrams, of the Sphirot. The 2 became widely known thanks to their inclusion in the foundational treatise Me'irat Einaim, Enlightening of the Eyes, composed by the renowned Kabbalist Rabbi Isaac of Akko, who lived and composed this around 1300. The first was designed to expose the correspondences between Sphirot, the 10 Commandments, the planetary spheres, the human body, and the 10 so-called utterances of creation, Ma'amarei Bereshit, Ma'amarot. These correspondences could have been made plain with a simple table. The diagram is a table, but has been reformatted as a rota calculated to conjure up the image of the celestial spheres. This connotation reveals the implication of the Sphirot in the very structure of the cosmos, alongside the other tens that govern reality. Although a rectangular table would have been easier to study, the message conveyed by the schema amplified the meaning of the data it organized. The second diagram in the Parma manuscript takes a more iconic approach, representing the Sphirot as the cosmic spheres. Each of the nested shapes is a Hebrew letter, the initial of one of the 10 Sphirot. The outermost is the Kaf of Keter, the innermost the Mem of Malchut. The placement and shape of the letters is meant to suggest circularity or even sphericity. The Kabbalists, we recall, were particularly fond of a metaphor they picked up from astronomers that likened the structure of the cosmos to the skins of an onion. This is not only the oldest graphical visualization of that Kabbalistic appropriation, but one that went on to become one of the most widely reproduced in the history of Kabbalah. The two miscellanies in the Bibliothèque Nationale and in Parma share one diagram in common, captioned Ilan HaChochma, the tree of wisdom. When I first saw it, it reminded me of Darwin's tree of evolution, rather than of a variation on or a precursor of the spherotic tree. And indeed, it is not a spherotic tree, at least not in the Kabbalistic sense of Sphirot. The Ilan HaChochma is rather a visualization of the cosmological core of Sefer Yetsirah. Two passages in Sefer Yetsirah account for most of its details. The first is already familiar. These are the 10 Spherot of Bilima. 1, the spirit of the living God. 2, air from spirit. 3, water from air. 4, fire from water. And 5 through 10, the height above and below, east and west, north and south. The second, which you see, other than what's blocked by my little inset, 12 diagonal lines radiating out of the 6 faces of a cube, separating in each direction the southeastern line, the upper eastern line, the lower eastern line, the lower northern line, and so forth. And they expand continually forever and ever, and they are the arms of the universe. The diagram, meant to be read from the bottom up, begins with a circle, or a sphere, represented as a circle, divided into 10 and labeled, it is 1, achat hi. As the inscription just above it confirms, this is the one of one, the Spirit of the living God. As the fount of all, the 10 Sphirot exist in potentiality within this sphere, thus its internal division. The node just above it on the central axis is labeled air from spirit. The other elements and their derivations, water from air and fire from water, are inscribed below the bottom and top horizontal lines of the central figure. These are the first 4 counted things, or Sphirot, as the term is used in Sefer Yetsirah, section 16 in the critical edition. The other 6 Sphirot are the 6 facets of cubic space, the height above and below, east and west, north and south, that you see now underlined. These infinitely extending vectors are also inscribed under the heading, the 6 ends, shesh ktsavot, you see, as well underlined. The Spherot of Ilan HaChochma thus have nothing to do with Spherot in the Kabbalistic sense of the term. Not surprisingly, Ilan HaChochma never entered the diagrammatic repertoire of later Kabbalists. Though it bears not a trace of Kabbalistic theosophy, Ilan HaChochma is the earliest extant visualization of an esoteric tree in Jewish sources. Understanding its visual language thus promises to sensitize us to the possible ways in which such figures were thought to do their work. A few bullet points suffice to demonstrate that a close reading of the tree is rewarded by insights with surprisingly broad implications. So, I'll begin. First, the oddly shaped central figure that you see before you is a cuboid, a cubic shape with edges of unequal lengths in plano, in other words, as it appears when flattened out into a single surface. Think of a Chinese food carry-out box if you're from the States. Probably the wrong conference to use that comparison. Its 12 straight lines are its edges, the edges of the cube. The 8 lines that radiate from its central node establish its 8 vortices. These lines, from center to corners, are not the static objects of modern geometry. They are, rather, the tracings of movements in time, in keeping with pre-modern Neoplatonist geometries that defined lines as unfolding from a single point. The central figure has the vertices and edges of a cuboid. It has only 5 faces. This it shares in common with other medieval planar representations of cubic figures, as exemplified in the beautiful heavenly city, which typically leave the 6th face of the cube open. This open 6th face is our vantage point from above. These images are associated with the Beatus manuscripts of medieval Spanish provenance, and the one you're seeing is a Bibliothèque Nationale Latin manuscript, 8878. For all its resemblance to a flattened carry-out container, the central figure does not fold into a cube with equal edge lengths, neither as a mental exercise nor when printed on paper and physically manipulated. Here's a testimony to the fact that I tried myself. If its vertices and edges were intended to suggest cubicity, its shape seems to be a representational allusion to the divine throne. The image may thus have been inspired by Sefer Yetsirah's "Set up the thing on its proper place and return the Creator to his throne." The group of 3 corresponds to the 3 labeled elements of air, water, and fire. The 7 doubles seem to be the primary referent of the 7-branch tree with its doubled nodes. The 12 simples correspond to the edges of the cube. The 7-branch tree growing out of the cube displays precisely 68 nodes. The importance of this detail was clear to the copyist of the Parma manuscript who reproduced it with uncanny accuracy. Furthermore, 5 nodes play no role in the establishment of the cube. 2 have been added beside those at the ends of the lower horizontal line, a 3rd at its center, a 4th on the air from spirit line, and a 5th at the center of the lower sphere. 68 plus 5 is thus visually encoded in Ilan HaChochma. Now the gematria, or numerical value, of Chochma is 73. the correspondence between this indexical feature of the diagram and the gematria of Chokhmah is signaled by the hash mark above the word Chokhmah as it is titled in our manuscript. Bringing these disparate insights together reveals the Ilana Chokhmah to be a sophisticated visualization of the core cosmology of Sefer Yetsirah. Neoplatonist geometries, iconic and indexical signifiers are cleverly combined to form a single integrated image. The ambition of Ilana Chokhmah brings Ramon Lull's 1295 work of the same name, Arboreal Schema, to mind. Lull's well-known treatise relies on diagrammatic illustrations. Gerhard Ladner's characterization of Lull's trees might reasonably describe Ilana Chokhmah as well. Quote, not merely logical schemata, they were also, and above all, ontological representations. They symbolize the grades of being, unquote. The similarity may bespeak familiarity, or at the very least, betray the workings of kindred Spanish spirits. Though not a Kabbalistic tree, an understanding of Ilana Chokhmah sheds light on the ways in which esoteric cosmology was graphically encoded in the milieu within which the theosophical spherotic system was only then consolidating. Although the Tree of Wisdom is no Ilana Sphirot, Sefer Yetzirah, with its biblically intoned axioms, would eventually wield considerable influence upon the visualization of the Kabbalistic tree. We recall, however, that the Arboreal Schema was distinguished for its ability to represent relationships that were not spatial, as in the kinship application associated with family trees. The hypostatic Sphirot existed in generative interrelationships, but were not coordinates of space, nor of time or value. The impact of Sefer Yetzirah on the design of the Kabbalistic tree is, accordingly, denatured. The Sefer Yetzirah of Kabbalistic trees is abstracted in what we might call a mathematical key. The 10 Spherot are, of course, mapped to the 10 medallions of the tree, the 22 letters of the alphabet that, together with the 10 Spherot, make up what Sefer Yetzirah calls the 32 paths of wisdom, are often assigned to the channels that network those 10 hubs. In an ideal exemplar, we might expect to find precisely 22 such channels. Their indexical reference to Sefer Yetzirah is, in such an exemplar, amplified by a further division into the 3 classes of letters of Kabbalistic trees. Is abstract the 3 mother letters, the 7 double letters, and the 12 simple letters. It is, in fact, exceedingly rare to find a Kabbalistic tree that carried the logic of this remapping to its conclusion. In such a diagram of the Sphirot, we see the 3 mothers as horizontal channels, the 7 doubles as vertical channels, and the 12 simples as diagonal channels. The rarity of this perfect projection of the numerical highlights of Sefer Yetzirah is due to its unfortunate clash with a notion around which a consensus was increasingly established amongst the Kabbalists, the exceptionalism of Malchut, the lowest Sphirah. Malchut was singular insofar as it received the abundance that flowed forth from the other 9 Sphirot without producing any of its own. It was a spherotic receptacle, and its place visualized accordingly, not only at the bottom, but below the constellation. The projection of 3, 7, and 12 was still possible to accomplish, but with rather less elegance. Such Kabbalistic trees still lay beyond the horizon, when Bibliothèque Nationale Hébreu 763 was being copied in 1284 from still older Spanish manuscripts. And this Bibliothèque Nationale manuscript is the bride, the Kala, before whom we have gathered to dance, Kala na'a v'chasuda kemot shehi, a beautiful bride, just as she is. I hope that my analysis of its extraordinary tree adds a new dimension to the scholarly appreciation of its great importance. The care and precision of its design and execution demonstrate the value assigned to the visualization of cosmological knowledge, and no less to its graphical realization in the creative esoteric milieu within which it was crafted and copied. Many thanks.